Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lode-Holt. My thesis is that most men are like me in this way, and to prove my point, I'll give you a hypothetical situation. You have just purchased a large item that needs to be put together. When you finish, you find that it's put together right, but you have some leftover parts. Maybe it called for 16 screws, and they gave you 18. If it's from IKEA, you've probably got that Allen wrench they give you to put it together with. What do you do with the leftover parts? My guess is that most men do what I do. You don't throw it away. You keep it somewhere, perhaps in the bottom of your toolbox. You never know when you'll find a use for it. This week, our morning moments are focusing on some important concepts found in the Old Testament that all start with the letter R. Today, our word is remnant. And that's what those leftover tools are in some sense. They are a remnant of the project, a leftover part that you think you might use or need in the future. But in the Bible, the word remnant means a whole lot more. In today's world, I suspect we know the word remnant most from the world of sewing. Fabric stores have remnants for purchase, little bits of cloth from a pattern that are left over and which might be used to make something small. Again, when the word is used in the Bible, it means much more. Basically, Bible scholar Walter Brueggemann says, remnant refers to survivors after a catastrophe. This word that we find in many of the prophets describes the judgment of God coming on the people because of how they have broken the covenant and chased after other gods. As the prophets describe the disaster, they quite often end with, "Even so, a remnant shall remain." So it's important for us to note that when the Bible mentions a remnant, it is usually in connection with the wrath and judgment of God. Frankly, this should concern us. Most of the time in the Bible, when God's wrath is visited on people this way, it is in the context of complacency and well-being. More to the point, when there is a general sense of complacency and well-being, there's a need to shake things up and call us back to God. Perhaps God has found that the only way to get our attention is to bring about a disaster or catastrophe of some kind. One of the most powerful examples of a remnant spoken of in this way is also one of the earliest. One of the earliest prophets who had his message written down was Amos, and he describes that the catastrophe visited on God's people will leave a remnant, something like the remnants of a sheep after it had been attacked by a lion. Not much remains, only 2 legs and a piece of an ear. Another illustration is that the people saved will be like the corner of a couch. On the whole, the idea is that the remnant of people that remain after the disaster is barely recognizable and in no good condition for the future. That's how severe God's wrath will be. And yet, the word remnant also points to God's mercy, and that's in the Bible too. It's important to note that even in God's wrath, there is mercy. God does not destroy entirely. A remnant shall remain. All we have to do to see it is to look at the story of Noah. All the world is wiped away, and God starts over with a remnant of all that was before. 8 people, Noah and his wife, and his 3 sons and their wives, and a tiny group of animals. God has compassion, and even in God's wrath, the way is prepared for a future. Another example is when the people went into exile in Babylon. Eventually, a remnant was brought back to reestablish Israel. As Brueggemann says, remnant is a way of speaking about both the judgment and the mercy of God, who finally will determine the future of all of God's people. So, what we begin to see is that the future of God's people rests securely in God's hands. The future, destruction and life, dead ends and futures, are all God's purview. There is one more implication of the idea of a remnant remaining. Those who did remain began to understand themselves as the carriers of the true faith, and that those who didn't survive were not. They were a unique community under a mandate to live a life of purity and obedience in response to God's word to them. They understand themselves to be, in some sense, the righteous who live by God's mercy and grace and respond in glad obedience. So often today we think so much about God's grace and mercy and love that we don't often give serious thought to teetering on the brink of catastrophe. My hope is that we will get to be one of those leftover screws in the bottom of the toolbox. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.